At the draft future, no, you're good. At the draft future land use map that we've created so far, and the Underhill portion of that, this will be the start of the conversation, and we'll look for a lot more input from you and the community and all of our municipalities as we go forward. And just a little bit of context, we are doing this with all of our municipalities right now, and our timeline is kind of taking us through the end of June in terms of our outreach, and we're going to do our best to support everyone in that process. So we're going for a little bit of regional consistency, but we also want to make sure that we are collaborating with each community to meet their needs, as we do at CCRPC. That's pretty much why we exist. Any questions so far? That agenda sound good? Try to keep this to maybe half hour, 45 minutes of me talking, and feel free to also jump in with questions if something doesn't make sense as we go along. I definitely want to keep this a little more back and forth if we can. Great. So Act 181 is essentially an update to Act 250. It's maybe not Act 250 2.0, but 1.5 if you want to think of it in those terms. What we're still doing at a core level is trying to reinforce Vermont's historic settlement patterns of compact urban and village centers surrounded by rural countryside. And we're trying to make sure that all the work we've done over the last 70 years in planning and implementing our plans is carried forward into the future, because we've seen some things that have worked really well. We've done a really good job protecting some natural resources in Vermont. We've done a great job investing in some of our community centers and providing some opportunities there. But there's clearly still some things that could be improved. Specifically, Act 250 and its permitting process, according to some, is a little cumbersome and maybe doesn't always jive with local priorities. And also, we are trying to make sure that the state investments in our communities are really going to the places where they need to go and really making a difference. Because all of that is in service of this idea of smart growth. We're trying to invest where it makes sense, be efficient with our resources and our limited funds, and make sure that that's also meeting all of our goals for the community. Sandy, I see a message in the chat. Is that for me?
No.
Okay, great, thanks. To get a little more specific about what Act 181 is actually doing, it's modernizing how we map all of our different planning resources and different planning investments. We are trying to make sure that everything aligns at a state, a regional, and a local level, and making sure that all those pieces all fit together. And we're moving Act 250 a little bit to a location-based jurisdiction system, because currently it is more project-based. It's more based on the size of a development. 10 acres or 10 units triggers Act 250 in most towns that have zoning, and then it creates this whole other level of review, which can be useful in some circumstances, but there are opportunities to maybe say Act 250 is not needed in certain areas and certain situations. So that's what we're trying to look at here. But we're still focusing on planning for growth, putting that infrastructure that's necessary where it needs to go, and making sure that our municipal zoning regulations are in place to adequately regulate development, and that is coordinating well with Act 250. Jumping a little bit to a few more specifics in terms of how this actually impacts regional planning, I'll mention that Act 47, the Home Act a couple of years ago, had a lot to do with municipal plans and municipal zoning bylaws, and you've probably been working a little bit as a PC on how to implement that in your own regulations and adapt to all of those state changes in state statute. We are in the same process right now with our regional plan. We don't have zoning bylaws at a regional level, but we are trying to coordinate with Act 250 a little better, which is essentially the regional and state zoning. So some new requirements for us, and part of why we're here tonight, is that we are trying to do more meaningful participation under Vermont's environmental justice law. And that's not just saying, we're trying to reach folks who haven't traditionally participated in the planning process, such as those who don't speak English very well, those who are Black or identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or people who have low incomes and often don't have time to come to meetings like this. We're also really trying to make sure that our entire engagement process doesn't leave anybody out and doesn't close the door to anybody, and that we are able to really take all of that information that we need to set things right for our new regional plan from the get-go as much as we can. So as I mentioned, we are focusing a little bit on environmental justice, climate resilience, and housing, because those are the topics of the day, the things we need to address most urgently. And CCRPC has already been doing that in our regional plan. We actually had started this process before Act 181 came about, and these were already going to be topics in our plan. But it helps now that they're backed up by statute, and we'll be trying to address them more thoroughly through this process and in all parts of our plan. The most important change for us, and part of why we're here tonight, mostly why we're here tonight, is that we have new standardized future land use mapping requirements. We have specific categories that are spelled out in statute now that we have to use when it comes to talking about land use. We'll talk about what those are in a minute, but the idea is to try to standardize to some extent across the state and among RPCs what we mean when we say a downtown center or a rural area, because historically, regional planning commissions have used the terminology in slightly different ways. So we're trying to make sure that it's clear to everybody what we mean when we say this is what a core center is and why we are denoting it as such and what that means. The last thing that kind of plugs back into Act 47 is that we now have these statewide, regional, and local housing targets that have to be incorporated into our regional and municipal plans. So as part of that, a new element of Act 181 was saying that we actually want a substantial majority of our housing needs and our housing targets to be accommodated in those areas planned for growth. That's a term we use at Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission to talk about our core centers as opposed to our rural areas. And that's kind of being reinforced in statute now as well. So we're trying to basically set the stage to say, here's where the land use is going, here's where the land use is and where we want most of our investments to go. And that's also where we want a majority of our housing to go. Not necessarily all of it. We recognize there's some amount of rural development, but really trying to put a number on how much of that is really going to be concentrated in our urban centers so that we can try to meet that target more reasonably and more accurately and make clear policies on how to get there, because that hasn't always been our strength. I'll also mention, this isn't anything new, and I've kind of alluded to that a couple times already. CCRPC has been doing regional mapping of land use for as long as CCRPC has existed, and our map already has a lot of these elements in it. We're just going to be kind of changing the terminology and getting a little more specific in a couple places. But this should look fairly familiar to you, and the overall look of this map isn't going to change too much. And we've been working with you as our communities to build this map from the ground up already, which should fit pretty well with what you've already been doing and support the local planning that you've put into place, because this map is actually based primarily on your zoning. So we're just trying to take that into this new framework. That's what we're doing. Any questions so far? Still making sense? Feeling good?
Yep, sounds great.
Great. So, I wanted to mention for context, you also have a future land use map at the local level. This should be familiar to you as well. This is obviously a little bit finer grained here than we have on our map. They fit together, but you've got a little more specificity in how you define some of these categories. And we are going to try to align with that as much as possible. So just wanted to throw that up there for context, that you still have your local map, you still have your local future land use, and we're going to try to plug that in with a regional one. Theoretically, if you didn't have this, you could adopt our regional future land use as your local future land use. Some communities are choosing to do that, but it's great that you have your own, and we want to continue to support that. So this is kind of where we start to get into the meat of things. This is the new framework for how Act 181 spells out land use. There's 3 sections here. There's the categories across the top of regional future land use. Most of those terms should look similar, and I'll go through each of them in a little bit of detail, but I also want to show you how they align and match up with the new state designation program. So currently we have 6 or 7 different programs or designations that you can get. There's downtowns, village centers, there's a neighborhood development area, there's a growth center, there's a couple others that I, of course, am forgetting in this very moment. But what they're trying to do is consolidate those down and simplify it into 2 programs, center and neighborhood. And we'll talk about how those coordinate with our future land use. The other thing across the bottom is Act 250 and how that location-based jurisdiction is going to come into play. For the most part, it's going to be Tier 2 is status quo, what we currently see Act 250 doing, 10 acres, 10 lots, 10 units across the board. They may get a little more specific in certain types of jurisdiction and certain elements of it, but for the most part, majority of Vermont is staying the same. What's changing are the Tier 1 areas, and there's 2 subtypes, we'll talk about those, where Act 250 exemptions will apply, specifically for housing. And again, you probably guessed it, those are aligned with the future land use categories. The one thing that isn't really aligned with our regional planning going forward is this Tier 3, way down in the corner here. That is a new part of Act 250 that is getting a higher level of jurisdiction, a higher bar of review for natural resources that have been identified at of statewide importance, and that are essentially going to have a lower threshold for jurisdiction, higher level of review. Those aren't necessarily related to our regional maps. We have to map some things that sound like that rural conservation category, for instance. But Act 250 and the Land Use Review Board are going to be in charge of that through a rulemaking process. We'll tell you more about that later. So bringing it back to the regional maps and the regional plan, we have these categories, most of which are familiar. We've got downtowns and village centers. There's 2 different types, but they really all kind of come into one category of centers. We've got some areas around that, planned growth areas and village areas. We have enterprise areas, though not necessarily in Underhill. Those are really focused on like a industrial park or a quarry or some place where there's commercial development that doesn't include housing. We have resource-based recreation, which is specifically our ski areas and lakeside resorts. Underhill probably won't have any right in your boundaries, but on the other side of Mount Mansfield, Stowe will definitely have some of that going on, as will Bolton Valley. The last category is rural, and it comes in 4 flavors. We've got hamlets, which are really crossroads, those small communities that are, or small developments within communities that are really just your general store, maybe a church, maybe a house or 2 and a gas station, and that's it. We want to recognize that those are important places for our communities, but they're not necessarily part of this whole downtown village center area plan for growth. Not looking for a lot of investment there necessarily unless they want to. I'll skip over the general for a second to say there's agriculture and forestry, which definitely is important to a lot of our rural communities because that's where a lot of folks are making their livelihood in either farming or forest management. So that's called out as an important category that we are mapping. And then there's rural conservation, those important natural resources that need to be protected that really we wouldn't want to build on anyway, wetlands, river corridors and floodplains, steep slopes potentially, also our wildlife habitat areas and core forest areas. We'll talk a little bit about how those resources are being put on the map, and we're still in the process of figuring out the details, but that's the general idea. Anything that's not in any of those other categories is rural general, and that's kind of your rural residential, anywhere from 1 acre to 10 acres of lot size, some amount of housing development, but mostly some sort of agriculture or open space. I skipped over transitional because it is optional. That is a category we can use to talk about a place that is not what we want it to be today, but could be something else in one of these other categories in the future. Potentially, we could apply that to our areas that have seen sprawl development or strip development, where you've divided things up along the road, and there's kind of a big parking lot in front and a big box store, and we want to kind of transition that to a little bit more of a walkable, resource-rich community, maybe with some additional housing. Again, not applicable to Underhill, but just so you know the context regionally. This could also be used if there was a place in your community that you said, hey, we've got some historic centers, but they're a little bit limited in terms of where we can grow, and there's maybe along a floodplain or river corridor, and we don't really want to invest a whole lot more there because it's not sustainable. Maybe there's another place in our community that we want to grow. Not necessarily true for every community, but that was put in there specifically for those mountainous communities that are seeing a lot of flooding lately and want to maybe transition out of that floodplain. So they want to be able to grow sustainably and in a resilient way into the future. That was a lot of information. Happy to go into more detail if you have questions at this point, or if that's not making sense.
Does anyone have any questions, or should Darren keep rolling?
I'm going to take that as I should keep rolling. There's a little more to get through, but I'll try to keep it succinct. So, couple things that are changing about how we adopt our regional plan, and I think this will be really exciting for you folks because you have two designated centers. You have to go to, in the past, you've had to go to the downtown board every so many years and get a renewal from them, maybe check the boundaries, and it's this process of trying to keep those designation benefits fresh for your community, but kind of a pain. What's great about this new system is that because we are talking about those downtown village centers and these areas that are connected to the neighborhood program going forward, once our regional plan is adopted, you get those designations and you automatically get the benefits, and you don't have to talk to the downtown board anymore. They're now called the Community Investment Board, and instead of talking about creating these designations, their job is simply to direct investment to these designated areas that have been mapped in the regional plan in collaboration with the communities and as approved by the State Land Use Review Board. That State Land Use Review Board is essentially doing a review and a check and balance on our regional plan the way we do a confirmation of your municipal plan. So they're making sure that we comply with statute, that our plan is consistent and compatible with our adjoining regions, and that we have gone through a robust planning process with our member municipalities and our community at large. Another role that they have, in addition to sort of approving that map, is reviewing the municipal opt-ins to Act 250 exemption areas, because the State Land Use Review Board is essentially the new Natural Resources Board. So they've taken over oversight of Act 250 and the District Commission program, and because they are trying to bridge the gap between regional planning and Act 250, they are the ones that are approving those Act 250 exemption areas through our regional plan. So we will talk a little bit about how that works specifically, but essentially we map those areas in our regional plan, going back to that framework document. We talk about which areas might be eligible for Tier 1A, that full exemption from Act 250, which means that the town has taken on Act 250 level review, and Act 250 isn't necessary, so they can skip that process. And that's going to be relatively few municipalities in the state, even the ones that have a lot of capacity and that are really looking to provide the benefit and the streamlined permitting for their projects. Most places are also going to see this Tier 1B partial exemption from Act 250, where we've said in this area, downtown center, village center plan growth, and village area, we've done some good planning work, and certain elements of Act 250 don't need to be reviewed again because we've kind of predetermined those. So up to 50 units of housing will be exempt from Act 250 in those areas that the municipality chooses out of the eligible areas. I'll let that sink in for a sec and come back here and reminded that it's all happening as part of the regional plan and the regional future land use map. Okay, we're going to move on. These new exemptions from Act 250 are actually also not quite new. There is an interim Act 250 exemption provision within Act 181 when it was passed last June that created some temporary exemptions that are similar to what we'll see going forward, but the geography is different because we haven't done the mapping process yet. I'll focus on the one that is relevant to Underhill, which is village center plus a quarter-mile buffer within those existing village centers and quarter-mile outside. A development project that came through your local process would up to 50 units would not have to go to Act 250. They do still have to get your local review. They would also still have to get any state level permits, wetlands, stormwater, VTrans, 1111 permit, etc. So there's still some state level issues that get addressed. They just don't have to go through that land use review through Act 250. I will also mention that within, if you do end up going for any of these other, well, sorry, I'll skip over that because that's not actually relevant to Underhill. That's the only one that really applies in this interim period. There are also some type-based on the right here exemptions from Act 250 specifically for commercial conversions, accessory dwelling units, and hotel or motels. Again, probably not super relevant to Underhill except that accessory dwelling unit. So the point is, these exemptions are already in place. They may already have made a difference in some of our communities in terms of allowing these projects to happen that otherwise wouldn't have or would have cost more, because we've recognized that we don't need Act 250 review. We don't need this high bar for all types of projects in all places. And the question about where do you want these exemptions to continue through that Tier 1B mapping process is what we're here to ask you about and talk about over the next couple months. There's a lot more information about those interim exemptions on the state website. These links are in the PowerPoint that I have shared with Larry, and I think he can post or send around to you later, or you can reach out to us and we'll direct you to those. So check with the district coordinators because they're the expert on them and also on the exemptions going forward. So we talked a lot about the nuts and bolts and the process. I think you're probably ready to start looking at the map itself and kind of see how this plays out. This is the regional view of our map as it stands today, version 1.0. You'll see all of those different land use categories along the side here. And you'll see that, again, for the most part, this looks very similar to the current CCRPC Ecos Plan Future Land Use Map. The biggest difference, honestly, is we've got, more resolution, finer grain approach in the rural areas, breaking that up into conservation, ag and forestry, and rural general. So we can talk a little bit about that because we're still figuring out the methodology, but again, overall pretty much the same. We already talked about these 3 tiers for jurisdiction, but I'll take this opportunity to ask if that makes sense to everyone. Are there any questions about Act 250 jurisdiction going forward in this new system? Sandy, go ahead.
We've looked at the village center maps, and I can't imagine that we would have any place to put 50 units anyways. And my question is, why limit it to this very condensed area of the village and not make it broader to include really the whole village area? It doesn't really, I don't know as we're going to benefit at all from that designation just based on how the map looks.
Yeah. So I want to clarify one thing about where that Tier 1B can apply. That can apply to any of those top 4 categories here. So your village center and your village area. I might have skipped over those a little bit, so apologies. The planned growth area and the village area are the neighborhoods around your core civic, commercial, and housing area of your village, your historic settlements where the buildings are the most densely packed and where all the activity happens. The planned growth area and village area are essentially those residential neighborhoods around them. They may still have some level of commercial in them. There might be a bit of a blend, but it's much larger than that limited sort of Main Street idea. So Tier 1B, Act 250 exemption up to 50 units, but all the way down to 1 or 5 or 10 will apply in the area that we say, in collaboration with you, is part of that village community. We do have some statutory criteria we have to follow in where those boundaries can lie. We can't just stretch it out to the entire community, but we think that it can certainly accommodate more land within that designation than historically you've been able to do with the downtown designation program. Does that answer your question, Sandy?
It does, yeah. Yeah, it's, supposed to be anchored by commercial businesses, which that kind of limits it. And, it's historic, except that, you can't include things that used to be commercial businesses but are no longer. Just some details of it that I don't know. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was pretty nitpicky, I think. And, if we want to really try to engage in smart growth, then we have to look at where we could actually grow. And if you're just, saying, well, we only want to make it these historical places, then, it just isn't going to accommodate future growth.
you're absolutely right, and that was exactly on the minds of folks who wrote this bill and this law. So the great news is we don't have to be so limited to those nitpicky commercial anchors and places that can already accommodate growth. We have the ability to kind of expand upon those those uh, previous village designation boundaries in collaboration with you. We can say if your village zoning area, for instance, is larger than your designated center, we can just wrap that in and say, this is the full commercial, civic, and historic core of this community. And there may even be residential areas outside of that, which are captured in that village area, but we can go beyond those existing designations. We're not going to shrink your designation, your current designation, to be smaller. We're not allowed to do that, and so don't worry that that's going to go away. But yeah, that's why we're here, is to check in with you about, would you like that to be a little bigger? All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Trying to remember where we were. Regional map. Tiers of jurisdiction. Okay, great. Yeah, I think I covered this, so let's keep moving. This is just a little more detail about how those Act 250 jurisdiction tiers are going to work. I won't go through all the details of this because you can check the slides afterwards and check the resources I sent you, but essentially, breaks them down into those different types, when they become effective, and how that's going to play out. There's also a lot of detail on this slide. It's here mostly for reference, but in terms of timing, wanted to show you sort of the long view. Last year we had Act 47. Actually, it was adopted passed the year before that, and you've been working to do all those preemptions in your zoning and bylaw. There's also those temporary Act 250 exemptions took effect under Act 181. RPCs were kind of getting ready for whatever Act 181 was going to bring. And then when it was passed, we are jumping into this mapping process and trying to coordinate everything. This new land use review board has also been getting up and running. They are seated now. They're getting their feet under them, looking at how to reorganize a little bit, and also starting that tier 3 rulemaking background research. But next year is where a lot of stuff is going to kind of come into effect. The new designation program goes live. The tier 3 rulemaking gets started. Regional plans can be adopted under this new framework. And if you were interested in it, you could apply for your tier 1A exemption directly as a municipality. But I think you're probably not going there, so we won't spend too much time on it. Last thing I want to kind of throw out and talk about before we get into some more discussion. We mentioned housing targets earlier in the night and how we are trying to align our housing goals with these future land use categories. We also have to create a municipal housing target for every community in our jurisdiction. So we are working on a process for that. We have a pretty good idea how it's going to work. It's going to be focused on a total number of units. So we're just going to give you a number and say, Underhill, it's up to you to figure out how best to meet these goals. And let me actually back up a second, talk about what a housing target is and isn't. It's not a quota. It is not a you shall create this much housing in your community or else. It is really more setting a firm number goal for how you want to meet housing need in your community. That's something we've had to talk about in regional and municipal plans all along, saying, hey, there's a housing element. There's a gap in our market here. Here's how we want to address that. But Act 181 is just asking us to get a little more specific because it's easy to say, sure, we want to support housing, but what does that actually mean? And does it mean, obviously the town's not going to be building housing on its own necessarily, although you could. It's really going to be the private sector. So what does it mean to have the municipality support housing? You've got zoning, you've got the ability to direct where infrastructure gets placed in your community. You've got partnerships with developers and incentives you can create. You've got options to say, here's where we don't want housing, and we want clarity on that so it doesn't get tied up in a legal battle. So those are all the things that are kind of going into that. And the other thing is that we're trying to get a little more diversity in housing types. I'm sure that's been something that's been talked about here. Not just single unit homes, but accessory dwelling units, maybe some duplexes, maybe even some multi-unit, smaller scale in your village centers to provide a more options for folks to live the lifestyles they want at the at the price point that they can afford. So all of those things are on our mind when we create our housing target for Underhill, for instance. And we are also trying to take into account your historic housing trends, what you've actually produced over the years and where that's been located, what you say in your municipal plan about where you do and don't want housing and how much and what that means, as well as any natural resource constraints and what's going on in your zoning. All of that is going to get bundled together in our calculation, primarily based on these new future land use categories and saying how much of that land in Underhill is available for growth and development and how much is appropriate, and what are some of those physical limitations that make it feasible or not to put housing here. We've been doing that through our planning advisory committee. Larry served on that when he was in Charlotte. I think he's now been reappointed as a representative from Underhill, so he'll be involved in the process and able to provide feedback. And we're rolling that approach out in the next month, and we will be putting that number out in early March. Questions, concerns, thoughts on housing targets?
No one. Does anyone have any questions? Roy, do you have a question?
I actually do have a question. I guess you all know that we don't have any sewer capacity in our village centers, and there's really no way to grow them. And maybe, and I know Jericho in the Flats, they did a study to look at that, and I'm not really sure. Could you enlighten us on what the possibilities are there, and what
I haven't read that
in Jericho when they did a study?
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you're done talking. Yes, I know they were doing a
Yeah.
study. I haven't read it in
Okay, thanks.
detail. Yeah, and essentially they're looking at um, bringing in sewer from other communities, or being able to pipe sewer to another treatment plant, as well as in-ground septic disposal, essentially on a larger scale than you would see for an individual home. And that's something that Act 181 actually contemplates, is uh, looking at soils that are suitable for septic disposal within these areas and around these areas, and saying what possibilities exist there. It may not even be public. It may be just saying, hey, like, this is a place where the potential exists for more individual homes to have viable septic systems. So let's try to invest there to the extent that we can. But there's absolutely a recognition that that is a driver of development potential anywhere in Vermont. So part of our approach for a small community like Underhill with limited septic resources is going to say, we're not going to expect you to accommodate a ton of housing when it just wouldn't be physically possible. So I can say for sure that Underhill's number is going to be among the lowest in Chittenden County, similar to a lot of those smaller rural communities where the soils just aren't that great. So does that answer that question, Roy?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. The last thing I'll also mention is that where those opportunities exist, putting that out in the housing section of our regional plan and your town plan, and putting it on the map saying, hey, this is potential, let's explore that, is part of the impetus behind Act 181. This is about saying, where are those opportunities and where do they make sense? And then let's start putting the planning in place and the investments in, for instance, a wastewater capacity study like Jericho did, to see whether that's possible. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but we just want to try to be more focused on how we meet those housing needs. I saw caller one ask to identify who was talking for the record. I've been talking to Darren Schibler from Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, but I'll try to remember that when we switch back and forth from different people who were speaking.
Darren, that was actually me who posted that chat, just to
Okay.
ask caller one to identify themselves so I could have it for the meeting minutes.
I
That's
gotcha.
all.
Thank you, Larry. Sorry for that confusion. Okay. I'm going to move on to this last slide, which is just another opportunity for questions or discussion. But after that, we can start talking about the draft map and take a closer look for Underhill, and then think about what that might mean in terms of how to reach the community and put this out there.
Does anyone else have any questions before Darren moves on? Okay.
Great. So I'm going to start with the map, even though I said we'd go in the reverse order. We saw this at the 30,000 foot scale, but just to kind of go a little further into what this looks like in Underhill, what you're seeing is the proposed future land use map. I'll flip back to the current map just to show you that not much has changed. We did have to nudge things in a little bit from the current village area category that we have in our regional plan, simply based on those statutory criteria in Act 181, and because we didn't want to go further out than what your zoning or future land use map currently say, and we want to talk about that if we are going to do it. But here's what we're looking at. Obviously, we've got Underhill Flats and the Riverside area in Jericho. Those are going to stay as they are, a joint, overlapping the municipal boundary center. There are those centers and village areas around them. So, we're trying to show that there's that core area that includes the library, the middle school, the Underhill preschool, and the post office. And I know that there's been discussion, I'm going to turn this off, about the old sawmill lot that is proposed for development on the Jericho side. So all of that is in the core civic commercial section of Jericho, as well as Underhill. The residential around that is where that village area comes into play. Let me turn on the parcels so you can see that a little clearer. So those small residential neighborhoods that have built up around there are part of that village area. We had a little bit of a tricky time figuring out how far up to go some of these roads for your village area in Underhill, and we're definitely open to talking about including more of these. We're trying to keep it with the general idea is to keep the areas, cohesive and ideally walkable, although we recognize that sidewalk and bike infrastructure is not always present, and that's okay in a small rural village. But just sort of getting your read on what really fits in this village area. I was thinking it could maybe go all the way out to some of these and the Fox Run Road and Sugar Hill Road, but wanted to check with you before we put that out there.
Can you tell me again the colors? So the purple's downtown, the pink is the village area.
Yeah, we have to fix the map a little bit because the center is one category in the downtown or in the designation program, but we have the ability to differentiate between downtown versus village center, and we're still getting the tweaks. But essentially, this dark purple will become village center. The lighter pink will be that village area. I glossed over planned growth area because I don't think there will be any in Underhill. It is essentially an area that has water and sewer infrastructure and has a really robust complete streets walkable network. So we don't see that necessarily happening in Underhill, but that could be something that happens in the future if you want to continue to invest in those elements of your village. But at a first glance, we thought start with village area. That seems to fit a little better.
Does anyone have any quibbles with the coloring?
And also, it's totally okay. This is your first time seeing it. I've just thrown it up in front of you. There's a lot to digest. Just sort of wanted to get a general sense of like, does it generally look okay, or are there significant things that you can already see we need to change? We will also be able to adjust this map based on your feedback once you've had a chance to digest it, and once we've published it so you can look at it on your own. I'm going to move on to Underhill Center just to give you a sense of that. So again, flipping back to current versus proposed, it's really the same, except we had to take out the river corridor areas, and the same is true in Underhill Flats, Riverside, because those are required to be excluded from those village areas in statute. I will mention we could put them back in if Underhill adopted river corridor regulations and FEMA compliant flood hazard regulations, but don't worry too much about it. The point is development's not going in those river corridors. We did actually expand a little bit beyond the existing designations, as Sandy pointed out. So the orange is that overlay. We try to include the entirety of parcels, not just that, initial 50 to 100 feet that the downtown board used to cut you off at. It just makes more sense to say this entire parcel is part of this program, even if development limitations might mean that most of what happens is up towards the road. We also wanted to capture a little more. I think we talked about going, we made sure we got all the Underhill Central School. We considered going further up Stevensville Road and Beartown Road again, but just didn't want to go a bridge too far in terms of what we consider the historic part of your village center. The remaining part of your village zoning in our future land use map, we did put as village area, so we want to capture that residential aspect. But again, there's some other neighborhoods that have popped up and that may be worth capturing if that seems appropriate.
Do you ever base this somewhat on the soil capacity? like if you went up one road, you might have really good drainage. So it might speak to, yeah, including that, but not the other area that's very hydric or something like that.
Yes, we absolutely want to put that in our considerations. That's one of the criteria for village areas is soils that are suitable for septic disposal and that could accommodate that growth. So if it looks a little more like a finger going up some of these roads and streams, we could try and do that to a reasonable extent. I'm going to zoom out a little more just to kind of get the big picture and talk about the rural categories. And I want to emphasize that those three rural categories, ag and forestry, conservation, and rural general, do not have any regulatory effect within our regional plan. We're just mapping them to say, here's where they are, here's where we think they should be. The Act 250 Tier 3 rulemaking and their status quo Tier 2 is going to really drive regulation in that from a state level. And again, you still have local regulations that are going to determine what can and can't happen there. Plus, there's the character of the land itself and the physical limitations of it. So we are going to probably try to make it look a little less patchy. It's based on, in these rural communities, these forested areas, a lot on the Vermont Conservation Design highest priority interior forest blocks and connectivity blocks, and it tends to show every little cleared area. So we're going to try to smooth those lines out a little bit, and we may even look at the Science to Action project habitat map units that Underhill, Jericho, and Bolton worked together to develop as a better way to map those things.
Is the
Overall,
light green the conserved area or is that the dark green?
good question. So the lighter green is sort of a teal. It's the rural ag and forestry. That's really actually coming straight out of current use and parcels that are at least 20 acres or more that are eligible for the program. It's a pretty blunt tool to talk about where agriculture and forestry is actually viable. We know that that's not always the case. It's a tax program, a tax relief program, so it's not necessarily showing where people are even doing all of their ag and forestry, but we needed something to start with, so that's what we went with. The darker green is that rural conservation, and I can show you a little bit of what went into developing those. So apologies for all the flashing maps and stuff, but these are all of the individual layers that informed rural conservation. So we have our river corridors and floodplains. We've got wetlands. We've got high elevation areas. And then we've got those highest priority connectivity blocks and interior forest blocks. That makes up the majority of it. Also, we'll mention we have the groundwater source protection area layers in here, and we're not necessarily including that in rural conservation yet, but we're thinking about it because we know that that's important to Underhill and your water supply. So we will take that into account if you think that that's important. But again, just emphasizing this is not regulatory. This is really just saying here's the general intended use of these areas and the goals that we want for land use so that we're not developing essentially, or that we are also valuing the resources that these provide, both in terms of forest and farm products, as well as wildlife and conservation, carbon sequestration, water quality, et cetera. Those are important things we want to highlight.
Yeah, so we just finished our natural resource inventory and mapping, which was done by Arrowwood.
Mm-hmm.
So, using those maps as much as possible makes sense to me. They're a little more specific than just using what the state has.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see how we can overlay those. The one thing I will mention is that because this is a regional map, we are going to rely more on regional and state data to inform it. But if there's something that's really in conflict or that you feel is being missed in that, we want to make sure that that's fixed and shown on the map, because this is also you're part of our regional community, and we want you to make sure that those things are clarified. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment and kind of just, again, open the conversation up to further questions, thoughts, and try to turn us more in a direction of, how does this land for you? What is this maybe going to mean for Underhill? Is it really going to mean much? And what are your thoughts, priorities, concerns, and what do you think we need to communicate to the public, to other boards and commissions? I will also mention that the Tier 1B request, that Act 250 exemption opt-in for your eligible village centers and village areas, that actually needs to come from the select board. We want to make sure that that's gone through the legislative body. We hope that they would take a recommendation from you if that's how you operate in Underhill. But we just want to point out that that is something we'll be looking for them to weigh in on.
Sandy, go ahead. Sorry, you first.
I did a lot of talking. Go ahead.
No. I insist. I have a question, but I'll go after you, Sandy.
Okay. Sort of in a philosophical way, I feel like whatever your map says will have to be our future land use map, and it's sort of taking away from us that ability to say, how we want to incorporate it into our zoning regulations and that sort of thing. So that's my observation. Maybe we would have the same result when we get done looking at our zoning maps. But it does seem like, why do we bother doing work if you're doing it?
Yeah, and I hope we can make this feel a lot more collaborative, because we don't want it to feel like we're wiping the slate and saying, okay, forget what Underhill did, we need to start fresh. We really are trying to build this from the work you've already done. So I did the mapping for Underhill, so if I missed anything crazy, I apologize, and I want to make sure that we uh, rebuild on that the way that is going to reflect your local priorities. That's why I'm here tonight.
Sandy, do you think this isn't what I was going to ask, but Sandy, do you think there's I don't want to say easy, I'm trying to think of the word, that there's a way to, for us, or I mean, obviously you have a lot more knowledge, but to highlight things from our natural resource inventory that we think this might not be capturing that are important? Like this isn't right, but like our top 10 list of things we think we wish were being shown on the natural resources side, or hopefully you get the spirit of what I'm asking. How would we do that?
Yeah, that's the thing that that I'm not sure about. I mean, it really takes some time comparing maps and looking at, okay, what did you do there? Oh yeah, that's going to accommodate all of these other things, and it's not like, okay, just lay it on there and we're golden. But yeah, and it also will depend on you know, what kinds of rules we associate with each of these layers, and maybe it won't matter whether we have everything on the map, if as long as we're protecting it in the way that we had in mind.
Yeah, and one thing I will mention again is, you can still have your local zoning and your local plan say something that you regulate locally. It may not rise to any regional level, but you still have that authority, you still have that power based on your plan and your zoning and the work that you've done. We're just trying to kind of sift it up to the regional and state level to highlight what's most important there. So, yeah, to the extent that we can overlap and make sure that things fit, we're going to do that.
Yeah, and it
And
also might be a place for overlays, you
mhm,
know, here's the big map, but if there's any subdivisions in this area, we have a more specific guidelines we want you to follow or something like that.
yeah,
I have a very, I hesitate to say big picture. It might be more, the right word might be vague question, Darren, which is, so if you had to, and maybe this isn't the right analogy, but if you were thinking of Chittenden County, or maybe not the state, maybe just Chittenden County, in terms of like a scale of like the state's plan is really emphasizing development in Winooski, or I don't know, but like something where it's really meant to, you know, pick development up at a good pace
mhm,
versus someplace where there's going to be almost no effect, or it actually would discourage development, right? Because of the
mhm,
matrix forest blocks or whatever, pick your
yep,
reason. Like if that's, and maybe you'll tell me those are the wrong anchors for my scale, but like, hopefully you see where I'm going with the question. Like, where would you put Underhill on that scale, and how you think this is going to impact us as someone who works with this on a daily basis?
yeah. I'm going to reshare my screen to just give us the big picture view again, since you're asking for that. You can see that a majority of those downtown village centers, plan growth area, village areas are in that existing Burlington metro area. That's what we've been doing all along. We've said we want 80 to 90% of our growth to go into those areas, as well as the village centers that are kind of those satellites around the metro. We don't want to say that nothing's ever going to change in Underhill and it's going to be disinvestment there, but we do want to emphasize that a substantial majority of what's going to happen is going to be right in that big blob of pink, and that's not something we want to change. The pace of development overall is going to have to increase because those statewide housing targets are setting goals that are much higher than we've historically been building. And that's something we've been highlighting with our Building Homes Together program, saying, we're kind of behind the eight ball here, and the backlog of housing is creating some of the market weirdness that we've seen over the last 5 years, where prices are out of control and everyone's in bidding wars, and we want to try to fix that. That's part of the purpose of the housing targets, is saying what would it take to normalize the market. But to answer your question, Brian, majority of that work's going to happen and not in Underhill. Some still will, and we hope you can find ways to, contribute to that, as well as meet some of the needs of your own community. And we know that rural
Yeah.
living is something that's really valued by people who've lived in Vermont for a long time and people who want to move here. So that's definitely something that Underhill offers, and we saw that in your housing assessment too, and don't want to ignore that.
Thank
I
you.
just can I just jump in here for a second and point out, while you have this map up on the screen,
Mm-hmm.
Darren, that if you run your eye down the right side of the county, you'll see a band of mostly dark green with a few sections of rural agriculture and forestry interspersed. And when we, at our last meeting, we had Jens Hilke, a state wildlife biologist, come and give us a big picture view of some of the most valuable habitat areas to preserve in Underhill. And he pointed out that this area that's on the regional map, designated as rural conservation, is among the highest value contiguous forest habitat blocks in the whole state, and certainly is a very important natural resource protection part of our region, and will continue to be so. And from the most part, you run your eye down that right side of the county, Underhill and Bolton and Richmond and Huntington all have some significant protections in place already, and those are going to continue. And I think as we learn more about how this process works, and is going to be respected through regional planning and through Act 250, or through the state land use planning process going forward, we'll see that a lot of it's about reinforcing the protections that already exist for those very important blocks of forest habitat.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they would like to share? Okay.
I have maybe a couple, just to kind of wrap up the conversation and give us some next steps. As I mentioned, part of what we're trying to do is bring this to everyone and say, here's what's on the table. Let us know if we're getting this right or if we need to adjust anything. Let us know what we're missing. And aside from coming here to talk to you all and maybe checking with Sandy or others who are interested about the details of the rural areas and how those overlap with your local work, is there anything we should be doing in Underhill or people we should be talking to who would need to know about this? Any other resources we should consult or things that need to happen before June? And I should mention our timeline at CCRPC is that we are doing this outreach work from now until May or so. We will be making a recommendation to our long-range planning committee on the exact boundaries of all of these land use areas as well as a housing target. And then they're going to adopt that or recommend that for adoption in our regional plan to our board. And over the summer, we'll start our formal adoption process, and it's going to take a little longer than it normally does because we've got that state land use review board. But to give you a sense of the timeline, between the next few months, is there anything we should be thinking about for Underhill that would be important to communicate?
Do you have any idea what the target number of homes might be at this point, or is that still to be determined?
It's still to be determined at a municipal level. We have the regional, the statewide and regional housing targets are out now, and I should look up what they are, but it's a big-ish number. It's pushing what we've done historically and what we are able to do currently. But I think if we make these investments and make these changes to our permitting process, they're within reason for sure, within achievable. Let me see if I can find that while we're talking. But I will say also that the municipal housing targets are coming out at the beginning of March, so stay tuned for that, and it won't be long before we have that number for you.
I guess just another question is just how you anticipate the current landowners will react to this sort of plan and their willingness to participate and to allow that land to be developed. And it seems like that's kind of a big piece of the puzzle, how you're going to get people to agree and to get on board with the plan and help realize that.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely want to lean on your expertise as the planning commission and folks who have been involved in zoning updates and the designation program. You've probably had some of those conversations with landowners about their interests and challenges. So if there's anything you can provide us, either an introduction or a good forum that we could present this at, or if it's just a matter of kind of going door to door and kind of putting that out there, or maybe setting up in the library and saying, hey, here's what we're doing. Would you like to know more? Would that make sense for Underhill?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to try to get as many people involved who are being directly affected.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Reaching out to some of the landowners that are going to be affected by the policies that we may be developing. And I also understand, I think that when the town sets up a certain plan or policy or regulation, that the regional planning commission works back and forth, so to speak, with the towns on their wishes, basically, so that the regional plan bends somewhat for the town and the town bends for the regional plan.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is absolutely what we want to try to achieve that balanced relationship, that give and take, and making sure we're supporting each other. So based on those comments I'm hearing, we might want to do some sort of direct outreach to maybe the people in the village center and village areas that we're contemplating. Maybe not so much the rural areas, because that would be a lot. Although if there are specific changes that, because we're not doing any regulatory changes there, we might stay in the background on that conversation. But we know that you're also going to be working on some regulatory changes based on that habitat mapping you've done. So maybe that's where we can help kind of tag team with Underhill on that.
Am I mistaken that actually the village areas would be affected in a positive way, right? They would then be able to, increase density or get some reimbursements and stuff, right? And yeah.
Yes, that is the idea, at least on that state designation program. It's all incentives, it's all carrots, opportunities for people to take advantage of historic preservation tax credits, maybe get some assistance with grants, maybe some town assistance with grants and planning studies. So that's the only good news there. The Act 250 exemptions, if the town chooses to opt into those, are also hopefully a benefit for people who live in those areas and developers who want to do some things that are beneficial for the community, that are creating housing in a way that's really fitting with the fabric of your community. It's possible some folks might say, I'm not comfortable letting go of Act 250 in these areas. I like having it around. I like having that additional forum where we can talk about issues that the town may not be able to cover because it's just not in the regulations or something along those lines. So that is a conversation we want to have with the community if that is a concern, but we hope that you'll see the benefits of having that Tier 1B exemption if it makes sense for your community, and if you feel like you're able to take that on, or that you feel like the planning work's been done and we can take the training wheels off in those areas.
Can you clarify again how that Act 250 exemption works? You had mentioned that it pushes the land use planning piece to the town, but then the other criteria are still administered by the state. Can you expand on that?
I did not explain that super well, so we'll go back to that. So I reshare my slide just to give you some visuals. Come on. Apologies for the back and forth on this. All right, we're seeing that more detailed screen. Great. So there's several different tiers, and the one that's going to matter to Underhill is Tier 1B, I think. I'll talk about Tier 1A later. Tier 1B is this limited exemption where within the downtown, village center, planned growth area, or village area, the exemption is that a project with 50 or fewer units of housing on a tract of land involving 10 acres or less, or a mixed use development which has that housing, is exempt from Act 250. So commercial development is still subject to Act 250 jurisdiction, even in that Tier 1B area. Any sort of large scale or large parcel development that might happen there would still go to Act 250. It's really just saying, in a place where we say we want housing, we're going to enable housing to be easy. And there is some criteria associated with that. And that's that adequate soils for compact development. That's that village area criterion. Plus, they are looking for some local land use bylaws to help make sure that those local issues are addressed. The difference that I may be left confusing for you, Tim, is Tier 1A is the complete exemption where the town would take over, the municipality would take over those Act 250 criteria. that is really envisioned to be a little more for like downtown Burlington, maybe Winooski, South Burlington, maybe a couple other places where they have such robust local review processes and staff to administer their bylaws that Act 250 really is duplicative. They're kind of talking about the same issues when a project goes from the local to that state process. If Underhill's interested in that, we're happy to talk about it, but suspect that you're going to be maybe more on that tier 1B, if anything.
And so then the Act 250 would still deal with, like you said, stormwater and traffic studies and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
No.
so let's say you had a tier 1B area, you had a project of 25 units, let's say. They won't actually go to Act 250, but they will still get their stormwater permit, their wetlands permit if applicable. They'll pay the traffic impact fee to VTrans if it's on a state road or near one. All of those elements will still happen because in your local process, you require an applicant to obtain any and all necessary state permits, which had included Act 250 land use permit before. In this case, it's just that one that goes away. The rest are still there.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for elaborating.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So anything else that we need to talk about? If not, I'm hearing that we will follow up with you about the map once we have that published and ready for you to take a look at and play with on your own in coordination with the housing targets. We will also try to work with you on some outreach to the affected landowners within the village center and village areas that we've contemplated on that map, and maybe after we've talked a little bit about where those boundaries might change. And at some point, we'll also talk to your select board about that tier 1B exemption potential. Would you rather we revisit that with the planning commission first before we bring that to your select board? Larry's nodding his head yes.
Larry has spoken.
It would be great, I think, to have planning commission support or a weigh in on where that tier 1B area ends up and then whether you think that's a good idea. What we'll do is once we have that published map, we'll say here's the areas that are eligible. We'll maybe do some sort of overlay or a highlight of like here's where it could be, and bring that to you and say, does that sound good? If so, we'll take that to the select board along with a summary of all of the outreach we've done and any questions that remain.
That sounds good, Darren.
Great. The last thing I'm going to do is put in the chat the answer to David's or Tim's question. Sorry, I couldn't remember who asked it about the state housing needs assessment. The housing targets are in that document. If you scroll a few pages in, you'll see it by county. There's a low and a high target for both 2030. Double check. By 2030 and by 2050. So that's the preliminary information, and we will break that down at a municipal level in the next month. All right, I will let you get back to the rest of your meeting. Thanks to Maya for taking notes. You know where to find us. We'll be in touch. If anything comes up in the meantime, please feel free to reach out. If you had a burning question that didn't get answered tonight, or you think of something overnight, or if you have a great idea for who we should reach out to, let us know.
Thank you, Darren and Maya, for your time and coming to the meeting.
All right.
Good night.
Night.
Hi, good night.
Larry and I do not have anything else scheduled for this week because we knew this was going to take pretty much the full 90 minutes from what Darren told us. So we have 7 or 8 minutes left if anyone has any thoughts on that. Otherwise, we are going into, in the next meeting, we're going to try to catch up on a bunch of stuff that I know we need to, like sawmills, etc. And follow up on Jens's presentation that Sandy was kind enough to put in. So next meeting will kind of be a catch-up meeting to circle back on things. There won't really be anything new. Anyone have anything about that presentation, or everyone's pretty good?
Brian, I want to just highlight that in the documents that were posted to the meeting page, there is, and I can actually share my screen just to refresh your memory about which one I'm talking about. There was let's see if that can get that to work. Nope, that's not right. There was a document called Underhill Public Engagement Plan for Regional Future Land Use Map Development. Wow, is that a mouthful? And now I'll try to share it. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, wait, here we go. All right, that should come up shortly. So we might want to, not tonight, we don't really need to talk about this tonight, but we might want to take a look at that between now and the next meeting, just to understand the work that went on to identify what public outreach and engagement about this process, what that could look like. We touched on it a little bit during Darren's presentation. So there were some specific ideas there at the bottom of page 2, extending onto page 3, about specific outreach activities to various segments of the community in Underhill, and various organizations and stakeholders. So think about these things. If there's, in light of the suggestion that we reach out to some of the folks who live in the villages districts in particular, like how does this play into that? How could we do that? What's the best means to do that? Think about some appropriate next steps, because I feel like this document was a result of some brainstorming that went on in that meeting with Brad and Brian and Darren. Was it? Yeah, that took place several weeks ago. It's before my time, so I wasn't involved then, but I think there's some great ideas here. But I think we also might be a little more selective in what we focus on in these activities, and not try to do everything listed here. That's it.
Can I chime in real quick, Larry, if you can hear me?
Yeah.
Jeff. Yeah, it's a great idea. I think before we, I guess, really bring it out to the public, we should probably actually determine what, if anything, is actually, in terms of land that's available for these, housing developments and such, actually exist, right? Like, so if we can, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to say like, oh, we're doing this thing versus, for Act 180 or 250, whatever, let's talk about it. But if there's really nothing to talk about, do we get everybody riled up right away? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like, it's the practical effect of like, yeah, we don't want to present theoretical ideas that can't actually be implemented. And
yeah, because then we're like, oh, we're gonna talk about this, but then like months later, we're like, oh, actually, we can't do any of this. So it's just like, oh, we got you all riled up for nothing.
yeah, I agree with that. We need to really understand how what Darren went through applies in Underhill, and what. Yeah, we want to present a plan that could actually happen versus saying like, this is what the law says and it might affect you.
Yeah, like if they think Underhill can support 50 houses, and we say, hey, we're gonna have this outreach about building 50 houses in Underhill, but then we look at actual usable land, it's like, oh, we can do 10 houses, right? Like, I want to make sure we really come to the table with true knowledge of what can truly be done versus what the state wants us to do, right?
It's tough to disagree with that.
I just wanted to say I happened to still be on because I was doing some email, but I hope that's okay that I hung around and
Yeah, of course, Darren. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no, I'm just saying, like, I don't know, I'm just throwing numbers and speculation out there, but, for our
yeah,
sake as a town, as the planning commission, I think it makes sense to have our internal discussions on what we can truly do before we actually, like I said, get everyone riled up over it. Because it's a hot topic, man. I mean, everybody, I mean, we've got projects that have been trying to be built for a couple of years now that still get, you know, um, negative feedback on. So to bring more to the table and not truly knowing if it can be done doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense.
agreed 100%. And we certainly don't want to poke any bees nests that you've already got going. So if you feel like maybe a lighter touch in Underhill in terms of outreach is more appropriate, and we kind of just filter this through you as the planning commission and say, here's what we're thinking about. Let us know if we even need to go to the community. That's totally fine. We're doing that in a couple places. Like Williston has said, hey, we've already done all this. People have growth fatigue. Like, just don't go too hard on that. And we've got to clear what we want and what's possible. So we can take that approach here too.
I think we should just put Jeff in charge of all community outreach.
Oh, I'm probably not going to sell it really good. So,
No, I feel like there might be an 8-1 vote in favor of that, Jeff.
yeah.
Does anyone else have anything?
I also am wondering, in the housing targets, we might satisfy all of that with ADUs that aren't in the village center at all.
That's an interesting point, particularly since one of the things Larry is compiling is trying to get the work we did on ADUs actually packaged up and ready to be road ready to go to the good folks of Underhill.
Yeah, I'll just mention that's really great. If you can accommodate your housing targets with ADUs, then we're all for that. So whatever makes the most sense for Underhill.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions, or should we, if anyone has a motion to adjourn?
I do. Adjourn.
Oh, that's David Edson for the record with a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Sure. Aye.
Jeff, our new community outreach officer, with a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Aye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Right.